Tunnel, Challenges and Opportunities. And we have a couple of presenters today who've really been involved with this project for a long time. I'm very excited to hear their presentations and also to have some Q&A from our audience here. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion and a very substantial look at the possibilities and opportunities that building such a tunnel will open up in the world. So this program is sponsored by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, which is one of the primary associations of the Universal Peace Federation. So in this series of meetings that we hold every Tuesday, we're really looking at the pivotal role that Korea plays in today's world and what would be the impact in the world of a unified Korea. If North and South Korea could come together and really create a bridge between Japan and South Korea and the rest of Europe and Asia. So the Japan-Korea undersea tunnel may seem like a rather pie-in-the-sky kind of idea to people to build such a long tunnel. But if you look at recent, projects like the channel that was built, just 20 years ago under the English Channel, that tunnel is about 30.5 miles long. It's about 57 kilometers. 50 kilometers. And that's not the longest tunnel in the world. The longest tunnel in the world is actually the Gotthard Base Tunnel. There's also the deepest tunnel, which goes under the Swiss Alps between the towns of Erstfeld in the north and Bodio in the south. And that is actually 57 kilometers long. So it's not, a far stretch to imagine that you could build a tunnel actually connecting these two countries together. So the proposed, the distance between Japan and Korea in a straight line is about 120 miles. So this is not so far out of the imagination. So today we are going to hear from two presenters. Our first presenter is Mr. Masayoshi Kajikiri, and he was born in 1970 and graduated from the theological faculty of the Sun Moon University in South Korea. And then once he was back in Japan, he was president of the World COP organization, a student organization there. And then the Federation of Student Associations for World Peace in Japan, where he was raising youth leaders. Later, he worked on leadership exchange programs with South Korea and China. And as president of the Youth Federation for World Peace in Japan, was very engaged in bringing cooperation between these different nations. So currently, his public engagements include as chair of the Association of Ambassadors for Peace and in Japan, and as president of the Federation for World Peace. And of course, what's important to us here today as the chairman of the International Highway Foundation in Japan. So we have a video presentation because at this time of the day in Japan, where he is, it is the middle of the night. So he sent over a very nice video presentation that we're going to play for you now.
Good afternoon and greetings to our moderator, Mr. Roger Wetherall, U.S. Coordinator of the International Association for Peace and Economic Development. Thank you for inviting me to speak about the Japan-Korea Tunnel project. I'd like to talk about the current status and challenges of the International Highway and Japan-Korea Tunnel project for peace and prosperity in Asia. But first, allow me to share the history of the Japan-Korea Tunnel project. Reverend Sun Myung Moon first announced the project to 800 scholars from more than 100 countries around the world that gathered at the 10th International Conference on the Unity of the Science on November 10th, 1981 in Seoul, Korea. Through this grand project, Reverend Moon's aim was to build a unified economic zone, a new civilization that unifies the East and the West, and a truly peaceful world. These were to be accomplished by creating an Asian highway that links Japan, the Korean Peninsula, and China. And it would then expand to the rest of the world, where it would develop into an international highway that links to the world's highway systems. According to his vision, 8 kilometers on either side of the international highway would be a neutral zone, an inviolable area where no country could interfere, where freedom beyond national borders would be guaranteed. Through an underwater tunnel, this project would connect Japan and Korea, two countries separated by sea. Dr. Eizaburo Nishibori was invited by one of his associates, an American scholar, to participate in this international conference where this grand project was announced. Dr. Nishibori was a famous engineer and researcher who worked for such companies as Toshiba. He met with Reverend Moon at this conference and was deeply inspired after hearing his speech. 2 years later, he appointed his trusted companion, Dr. Yasuo Sasa, as the first president of the Japan-Korea Tunnel Research Institute. Dr. Sasa was a leading expert in underwater tunnels and served as a technical advisor in the construction of the Seikan Tunnel, the world's longest undersea tunnel. The Japan-Korea Tunnel Research Institute was established in this way, and it is currently engaged in research activities with former Minister of Justice Taizo Nozawa serving as its fourth chairman. Prior to the Institute's launch, the International Highway Construction Corporation was established in 1981 to undertake the actual construction operations, and geological and route surveys began soon after. At that time, the agency owned the 6-seater Cessna, the Skyhope, and 3 research vessels, Teianmaru. The survey was carried out from land, sea, and air, making full use of these crafts. Based on the vast amount of data collected through these surveys, the Japan-Korea Tunnel Research Institute compiled a report in 1996 for the tunnel project, in which it determined the route and construction method. The starting point of the Japan-Korea Tunnel is said to be Shinzeimachi, Nagoya of Karatsu City in Saga Prefecture. A groundbreaking ceremony to begin the tunnel excavation was held on October 1st, 1986, with scholars, engineers, and other affiliates from Japan and Korea in attendance. After that, there were several interruptions, but construction of the tunnel has proceeded, and currently 540 meters in length have been dug, 56 meters below the surface. The plan is to drill another 1,000 meters, connect it to an advanced shaft, and then to drill a working shaft and main shaft. In response to Reverend Moon's proposal in 1981, the Chinese government took great interest in the project and approached the International Highway Construction Corporation. At the invitation of the Chinese government, Mr. Gentaro Kajikuri, then chairman of the International Highway Construction Corporation, met with then Vice President of China, Mr. Wan Chen. Mr. Wan echoed the idea of an international highway and immediately responded to possible difficulties in convincing North Korea by saying, "That will be my responsibility." In addition to promoting the International Highway and Japan-Korea Tunnel project, Reverend Moon proposed the Bering Strait Tunnel project in 2005 at the founding of the Universal Peace Federation. This is also a grand initiative that looks to connect the Bering Strait between Alaska in the United States, another symbol of the division of East and West, and Siberia in Russia. They will be connected with tunnels and bridges, and to the rest of the world through the International Highway and Japan-Korea Tunnel, which will help create a single community. At the opening plenary of World Summit Africa 2018, held in Dakar, Senegal, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon, the wife of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, said, "Therefore, I am advocating a peace highway which will travel from the south of Africa, from the Cape of Good Hope, through Africa, Europe, Eurasia, and Asia, connecting all the way to Korea." In this way, the Japan-Korea Tunnel has been proposed and referred to not only in Japan, but also internationally. However, I believe that there are three issues that need to be overcome in making this tunnel a reality. First, an agreement between the governments of Japan and South Korea, as well as gaining understanding and public opinion of Japanese and Korean people, which will form the basis for this agreement, will be required. Understanding from the US, other countries, and the international community will also be necessary. Second, the project must prove that it can be a sustainable business. And third, technical issues need to be overcome. Although research has proved excavation is possible, further investigation is required in order to determine other construction technologies and time frames. As I just mentioned, the first challenge is to reach an agreement between two governments. In order to do so, public opinion must first be formed in Japan to prepare lawmakers to make the Japan-Korea Tunnel into a national project. With that goal in mind, councils were formed in all 47 prefectures to promote the Japan-Korea Tunnel, and based on this foundation, a movement was launched to make this into a national council. Currently, the prefectural and national councils are working to reach an intergovernmental agreement within this decade. That's all I have to share. Thank you very much.
A big thank you to Mr. Kajikuri for his presentation. Next, we're going to move on to a presentation from Mr. Stephen Costello, who is the Director of Asia East. Stephen's an independent analyst and consultant at Asia East, which is a policy platform for analysis on Korea and the East Asian region and all US interests in that area. And he's a non-resident visiting scholar at the Institute for Korean Studies at George Washington University and a non-resident visiting researcher at the Gyeonggi Research Institute in Uijeongbu, Korea. How's my Korean pronunciation,
I
Stephen?
think you got it. That wasn't easy.
Good. So he was formerly director of the Korea program at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. from 1999 to 2004, and director of the Kim Dae-jung Peace Foundation in the USA from 1990 to 1997. And I know that he's had a lot of interaction with Kim Dae-jung personally, and he was a big supporter of the tunnel. So we're really interested to hear from you, Stephen. So if you want to take it off, I know you've got a presentation to share. Do you want to bring that up now, or?
I think just a little bit into my presentation.
Okay, and I'll let you take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Roger, and thank you, Alan, for inviting me. It's a great honor to speak to you folks. I was saying to Roger earlier that I feel sometimes that this specialty of Korea and Northeast Asia and the political and policy space feels like a very narrow interest. And I'm always happy when anyone else really pays attention to it. I'm going to walk through a presentation here. I'm going to try not to redo some of the excellent points that Mr. Kajikuri made in his statement. It was wonderful to hear from the Japan side how organized they are and how they too have been working on this bridge tunnel project for 40 years and more. So I'll walk through there and make three main points about the economic, and then the strategic, and then finally the political logic of commencing this project in a much more practical and serious way. The Korea-Japan Bridge Tunnel KJBT project has been understudy for a long time. In some early forms, this goes back 100 years. In modern times, serious exploration of the concept has been the subject of parliamentary groups in the Korean Assembly and the Japanese Diet for 30 years. A particularly professional and well-organized group has done extensive work since 2008, the Korea-Japan Tunnel Research Institute in Busan, and I visited them during the last 2 summers for briefings and tours. The Busan Goje Bridge Tunnel, which was completed about 12 years ago, is a very useful demonstration project that those people in Busan have to look to. Let me share with you just a couple of photos. Is this clear?
We can't see the screen yet. Did you share?
All right. Oh, hold on. Here we go.
Great, we can see it now. Thank you.
I went to Busan with Dr. Kang Jae-hong, my old friend from decades past. He headed the Korea Transport Institute during the late 90s, early 2000s, and he helped me arrange much of this. He's very good on these issues. Here you can see that the bridge tunnel would consist of 2 bridges and 1 long tunnel. Total distance about 5 miles. This is the one that was completed in about 12 years ago. Here you can see the 2 bridges. And the length of this is very similar to the Orasan Bridge Tunnel. Here I am with Dr. Park and Dr. Kang at Goje. Here on the left would be the undersea part. The tunnel goes to that island. And then just in the middle on the right, you can see the 2 bridges. Going into the tunnel, one of the bridges. This is a reminder that the Busan area is very well positioned already as a very big deal sort of regional hub for shipping. They're building a new airport. I grew up in New Jersey, and I drove by the New York container port many times, and that looks a bit small compared to what they've already done in Busan. Although the project does not yet have the political and public support it'll need in either Japan or Korea, its inherent logic is hard to dispute. The project's eventual completion is therefore somewhat inevitable. Here are some ways in which that strong logic could be used in coming months and years if key people and institutions see that logic. I've worked more than 30 years in the political and policy space here in Washington and in Seoul, and I know many of the actors there. So I'm going to try to stick to what I know here. And one reason that I focused on this for a decade and a half is because not only the economic, but also the strategic and even political logic are so strong. The economic justifications are the easiest to see. Some estimates are that the work could cost $10 billion and take 10 years. Others say it would be $7 billion in 8 years. Advances in engineering have made it far more realistic. The technology used to create the Goje Bridge tunnel has now been surpassed. That was 12 years ago. As Roger pointed out, the Swiss tunnel, the longest one, used brand new technology. They were drilling largely through rock. And in some ways, you could say, compared to that, this will be easier. Let's also remember that the longest tunnel piece, which is the biggest challenge for the Korea-Japan Bridge Tunnel, is about 25 miles, I think. And in today's undersea tunneling and rock tunneling world, that is not insurmountable. Advances in engineering, oh yes, the additional economic value to North Korea, China, and Russia is also clearly great. And all three would welcome development in the areas surrounding their common borders. Here, let me bring up a little bit of Dr. Sung-Yul Park's. Can you see this?
Sorry, I think you stopped sharing your screen.
All right, I think so. Hold on. Okay. Is that good? Okay.
Yep, that's good.
This repeats some of the points made already by Dr. Kajikuri, but there are a couple of things I want to show you. I think Dr. Park has an excellent graphic team. He is nice enough to call me professor, but I'm not a professor, so please, not yet anyway. This history is important. And this one in particular, notice that President No Tae-woo in 1990, together with Prime Minister Kai-fu Toshiki, expressed his support. Then Kim Dae-jung in September 2000, along with Yoshihiro Mori, and then finally, February 2003, Roh Moo-hyun president. For someone in my political policy space, that's extremely important, particularly for South Korea. It's very much a bipartisan issue. Even in the latest battles over the presidential election, the support for the Korea-Japan Bridge Tunnel was discussed somewhat in the Busan area in the Busan elections. And again, it was not a partisan issue. Dr. Park then goes through a very good several points here about the logic of this, the international trade network, the cooperation between Japan and Korea. His first one here is really important because of the Korea, Chinese, Japanese nationalism being somewhat suppressed. These are not only aspirational, they make an awful lot of sense if you look at geopolitics today and what's being said in these countries. I'm going to leave this here. Okay. The proposed link would join with the railroad communications energy corridors along the east and west coasts of the Korean Peninsula that are already partly completed. We saw some movement on these corridors during the Moon Jae-in administration in the last 5 years. As soon as the project was seriously endorsed and begun, the value of the existing corridors would be multiplied many times. Special economic zones that are contemplated for the southeast coast of North Korea, the Gaesong Industrial Complex, and many others would be more integrated into a regional grid. Extensive work on these zones has already been done by the Kyunghee Research Institute and the Korea Logistics Forum, among other institutes. And I've had extensive interactions with both of those big NGOs, particularly the GRI. The level of their detail is remarkable. And I can testify, I've been working these issues of politics from Washington for 30 years. Nothing in Washington comes close to what institutes in South Korea have done in terms of sketching out what would work, why, the economic rationale, the strategic rationale, and the rest. Upon completion, the assets and contributions of the world's third largest economy, Japan, would be linked more easily with those of the seventh and first largest economies, South Korea and China. But the strategic rationale, my second point, the strategic rationale for the KJBT would be just as convincing. Japan would have increased engagement with South Korea and therefore increased security. Its defense costs could be reduced. The relative bargaining power of Japan, South Korea, and North Korea would be enhanced so that their value to China and Russia would be far greater. This could lead to expanded economic and political engagement, reductions of arms expansion, and new security and arms control and arms reduction agreements. Some of this was quite clear during the 1990s. The slow progress that was made in the early 90s under the George H.W. Bush administration here, and then increasingly under the Bill Clinton administration, drew reactions, very clear reactions from the Japanese and from the Chinese, most importantly. You can research those. Someone should do a dissertation on those reactions, because in both cases, although there was sensitivity that we all know about any sort of increased cooperation between the two Koreas, the net value to them, both China and Japan, was clear and was clearly embraced. And I think all of the smartest researchers, even in the US side, understand this. For the US, the decision by South Korea and Japan to invest and collaborate in the KJBT would signal a great advance in their relationship, these two US allies. South Japan cooperation is today one of the highest priorities of the Joe Biden administration when it attempts to rebuild US relationships in East Asia. It will certainly be a subject when Biden meets Yoon in Seoul on Saturday. That cooperation would clearly benefit the US effort to have its two Northeast Asian allies in closer strategic alignment. Common values such as high standard trade and investment rules, democratic and legal institutions would be strengthened as well. I cannot underscore too much how important this could be for the haphazard and barely discernible Biden administration approach to Korea and Northeast Asia. A major move by South Korea and Japan would be quite significant, both strategically and politically. The KJBT would allow all 6 countries, China, Russia, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and the US, to reduce arms expenditures, to seriously embrace a list of arms control and arms reduction agreements. I would remind everyone that a very good case for this was made by the former acting CIA chief, John Brennan. He wrote something a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about the Ukraine war and Russia and the impact on China. But one of his strongest points was about how this shows we need to get back to the arms control table. And the North Korea-US arms control agreement is obviously the one that would make the biggest impact in Northeast Asia. The project would provide large incentives to cap, roll back, and eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapons and ICBM programs, for instance. Now, this is my territory, North Korea's nuclear and ICBM programs. All of this works together. It always did. There was never any issue where you would have one piece of infrastructure that didn't impact everything else. Unless a government is looking at the interlinked nature of infrastructure, arms control, political support, economic benefits, then that government can't really act and it can't see things clearly. The ability to shift spending from military and security toward development and productive investments could transform economies. To the extent that the US, South Korea, and Japan are concerned about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, so-called BRI, the KJBT would exert positive pressure for the Chinese to join the regional infrastructure initiatives. At the same time, it would also pressure Chinese investment to be high standard, transparent, and cooperative, all things that we know we want, and so do the South Koreans and the Japanese. The ability of companies to join in the project from many countries would be a healthy way to grow jobs and steer government attention. Let me bring up one more here. Sorry, just one moment. Is that up?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. This very much is the issue. And, particularly during the 1990s, it's important to remember that that decade was a very important time for American policy toward Korea and Northeast Asia. It was the one time in the past 30 years that the American side played a positive role for strategic and security in this region. Since 2001, they have greatly failed at that role. But back then, there was quite a bit of understanding among people at the White House and in the State Department. And I talked to these folks regularly, and of course in the intelligence community, that this was the game. You have this existing situation, and you have this as a goal. This in no way implies reunification, although others use it as an obvious aspirational thing. no serious policymaker could use it to really good effect right now, I don't believe. Even Kim Dae-jung, all during the time I knew him in the 1990s, was adamant that reunification is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the beginning of increased cooperation, seeing each other's interests, common interests, and beginning to work together. It begins with economic interests. Slowly, political interests would grow. And those political interests, even at the very beginning, would be absolutely recognized and reacted to by both Chinese and the Japanese. Let's remember that when the North and South do talk, it is not like two governments anywhere else on the globe talk. There were no interpreters needed when they talked. It also wasn't like any other two adversaries, for that matter. You know, any of us who worked in this area for years were, you know, mouth agape at these meetings and these pictures. You know, you can't get it out of your head. But there are very important practical lessons here. It shows what is possible, and it shows that we don't have to invent the wheel. I happen to know many of these people. Kang Kyung-hwa, the foreign minister, South Korea. Lim Dong-wan, who I worked with very, very much in the 1990s. He headed the Kim Dae-jung Peace Foundation over in Seoul. Park Ji-won, my friend for 30 years, now head of the Korean CIA, and Moon Chang-in, advisor to presidents and professor. The North-South personal infrastructure is there. This is simply an illustration of how the Korea-Japan Bridge Tunnel immediately elevates and turbocharges the two corridors up the left and right side into Russia and China, and how they would all be more easily embraced and even more politically embraced with this. This just shows the method. Remember, this is 12-year-old technology. These long football field size sections were built on shore and then floated out and dropped in order to create the tunnel. Something like this or something much better would surely be used in the future. This shows the strategic and the strategic stability of this region. There are many things you can read into this. This thing itself is 12 years old from an excellent center in Zurich, but it remains relevant today because the strategic strength of democratic and status quo forces is quite large and would obviously be enhanced by all this. This is to give everybody a little bit of a breather at the end of a presentation. Okay. So my final point would be simply that the political uses would also be extensive, and today they're clearly undervalued. A Japanese prime minister or a Korean president would be very wise to see this initiative as a legacy-making investment. Because of its size and because of its many impacts on people and communities, a smartly constructed project would have massive and multiple political uses. Today, the political profiles and the domestic needs of both Fumio Kishida and Yoon Suk-yeol suggest that they could both see deep political impacts from their individual or joint embrace of this project. And I really think that's what we should all be working on in coming months. Finally, buy-in from the public and from institutes, universities, and NGOs would be enthusiastic and would give meaning to many civic efforts for social progress. People would remember who led this effort, who was its champion, who worked hard to make it happen, particularly for politicians in South Korea, Japan, and even a bit in the US, who have a strategic sense. This could leave a large, meaningful legacy to be very, very proud of. So I'm going to stop it there, and I welcome any comments you might have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's an excellent presentation and a lot of food for thought in this. We have a couple of questions from our audience, and if anybody else has questions that they want to direct to Stephen, please just type them into the chat window now, and I'll try and get to them. But for me personally, I was wondering, in terms of the engineering challenges that are involved here, I wish we had Mr. Kajakuri here because I'm sure he knows a lot more about that. But do you know, first off, if the preferred method at this point is to do a bored tunnel or a sunken section tunnel like the one that you were showing at the end?
Offhand, I'd say probably some kind of sunken section. And it may vary depending on the makeup of the earth down there. But both the Orasan tunnel, if you look at the profile of what they did, they too did a sectional thing, and then they filled it over with earth and other things. You would also have to figure in the likelihood that there might be some level of seismic activity. So it would need to be flexible up to some point. I think that's entirely doable, but that would have to be done. My guess would be that it would probably be sunken sections. And you might, being 25 miles, you might have some ability halfway through to relieve pressure or have some other arrangement. But it's a good question, particularly, your question recognizes that boring technology is one of the things that's gone so far now that it's probably much easier than it used to be. I just think that in terms of ease and flexibility, perhaps those sections would be better.
It's interesting. I have an engineering background, so these questions always fascinate me. The seismic issue is a big one, of course. People need to feel that they're safe. And just getting air down there is also a huge challenge, right? So the other thing is a lot of the images we saw show cars driving through the tunnel. How realistic do you think that is?
I think that's possible, but I would agree that a lot of the transport could and probably should be loading onto trains and having the trains go through.
Yeah.
And I see in some of the materials that others have discussed this as well. One of the ideas, for instance, is to have only electric vehicles go through.
That would cut down on the pollution and the need to kind of constantly ventilate it, which is a big issue in modern vehicle tunnels. Yeah. And you'd have to look at fire possibilities and all of it. But I'm quite confident. I don't follow the engineering closely enough, and I don't want to try to reinvent the wheel, but I'm quite confident they could solve these things. But as you suggest, probably, a loaded transport would be one of the best and most efficient ways to do it. Right. Well, that's the approach that they took for the channel, right? Is any vehicles that want to go through, they load them onto the trains at either end, and then they just send them through and unload it. And they've made that very efficient too, I believe, so that it works very well these days. And then, of course, you can get off and drive where you want to go from there. So a couple of questions here. So Larry's asking, this is such a great idea for many reasons, but for just the economics alone, why aren't there more corporations interested in this project, or are they, and we just don't hear about them?
I would say, Larry, it's B. They are. They're up and ready. They have their own feasibility studies. If you simply look to the companies and even some of the consortia that were involved in the Goje Bridge Tunnel, they have serious online profiles of what they did, how it was done, how much it cost. They have up-to-date engineering descriptions. And I would say there are dozens of companies that do this now. As you mentioned, there are several tunnels all over the world. So I think the real issue isn't so much a lack of capability. That's what I have found all along here. The companies are ready. They've done demonstration projects. They've done real projects. It is just the political piece. And I don't want to hit this too much, but we have to understand just how far out of it our political leaders are when they look at policy toward Korea from Washington. And even when some in Korea look at this, they really need to be brought up to date on this. How that's done, I'm not sure, but that's the challenge.
Well, maybe we've got some people listening into this program here who will take the initiative and talk to their legislators, right?
Larry, did you have something else?
Yeah, Stephen, I just, knowing how aggressive Japanese and Korean business people are, and there's such silence on this issue. I mean, it's deafening silence. Are they working the back channels? Are they pressuring and twisting arms in the legislature? Are they doing something? Because I would think they would be. I'm amazed at that it's not a kitchen table conversation in the corporations.
That's a great point. And I think because it speaks to the politics, I mean, companies with big investment potential pressuring the government is the oldest thing in the book. And it's logical and smart, and it should have results. I'm pretty certain that what's going on is these companies are poised as hell, but they look at the shallow posturing of the government in Japan or South Korea. They look at the voices of politicians, particularly, I've been following the Korea-Japan dust-up for years, and it's not pretty. And I can easily imagine politicians being scared to death of even touching this. I was on a Zoom meeting with Chinese and Japanese scholars from Seoul a year or so ago, and this Korean guy came up after my presentation and said, well, this is obviously just going to benefit Japan. Koreans don't like Japan. We wouldn't do this. What's the matter with you? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, you've got quite a bit. But as I pointed out, and as you said, I think the rationale is so strong, it simply needs to be organized and directed at the right people. I think that's pretty much where we're at. But I appreciate your point.
So speaking to the political difficulties there, I mean, knowing the animosity that exists between these three countries, China, Korea, and Japan, have you seen any progress, and what is happening that might give us some hope there?
Yes. In particular, I've spent my time very much focused with the Democrats in South Korea. And now, I mean, it feels very much like the small d Democrats, because conservatives in South Korea have never really gotten over the coming of democracy after 1998. So it's, their ability to see this larger issue and what might happen with Japan, with North-South Korean cooperation, and even with Japan-South Korea cooperation, their ability to see that, I think, is very much compromised because they haven't really wrapped their minds about being a Democratic Party yet. And I'd say something similar about the Japanese LDP, without getting into a partisan thing. Both of them value other sorts of battles, and the images of confrontation and, historical positions. It is largely either Democrats or civic groups in both cases, but they're working on this. They are very much aware of it. There are big groups, as I said, particularly in South Korea. I know there are a dozen groups that are, the Korea Logistics Forum. They have a wonderful logo, the Kolofo. But they're a group of experts, PhDs, engineers, scientists. They were headed by a former prime minister.
Mhm.
I mean, they're on top of this completely about the role logistics could play. Let's remember that from anyone's political or strategic viewpoint, Korea is an island and Japan is an island. They're both islands. Until there's greater North-South Korean cooperation, South Korea is an island. And this would begin to change that. You could even make a strong case that for the Japanese, this would be an even bigger benefit than for Korea. But that's kooky to go there. It makes sense for both of them for a long reason.
Hmm. Yeah, I've read some reports that say that building the tunnel or using that for shipping freight between the two countries could reduce costs by as much as 30%. And certainly the time to ship would be much shorter. Currently, it takes like 20 days because you've got to load things into containers, put the containers on the railway, take them to the ports, put them on the ships and do all the reverse at the other end. But this would, you just put it on the train and it goes straight through, right?
Yes, that sounds correct. And I can tell you from the early 2000s, my friend Dr. Khan there, I brought him to people here at the State Department and the intelligence agencies and talked about this whole train idea. He was talking about these corridors up the East and West Coast. And these guys on the US side were saying, of course, that's leverage. That's wonderful. I mean, you know, very quickly, the value of those corridors and the costs that could be saved. And obviously that then connects, as Reverend Moon said, 40 years ago, it starts to connect over to Asia and everything else as soon as you get it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly a visionary project for the future when you think about it. But even in the short term, you mentioned the defense and the strategic aspects. One thing about a tunnel is it's invulnerable to air and sea attacks, right?
Yes, I love that point because, you know, people who don't do their homework will say, oh my God, you know, the tunnel's here and now the Japanese can invade us again or, you know, something like that. So you're right. In the one sense, it's invulnerable. On the other sense, in the other hand, it's entirely easy for any country to shut it down. I mean, in the blink of an eye.
Yes.
Just as the British did, you know, with Brexit, you saw what happened there. That was those poor folks were backed up for days, you know. So yes, it absolutely depends on a level of trust and institutional, you know, sort of professionalism that I just hope is not sliding away.
Yeah. Yeah, I have an interesting question here from Mr. Dale Garrett, Dr. Dale Garrett, sorry. He's asking, he says, linking the Japan-South Korea tunnel to China's BRI would be very beneficial to the economies of both countries, but North Korea puts political stability through isolation as a priority over economic development. So how could the DPRK be brought into this discussion of an international transportation project? Do you see any hope there?
Yes, I'd rephrase that. And I'd say that, you know, from our evidence, the DPRK understands the tension between economic development and state control. They always have. In the 90s was the best test we had, you know, by far, because there was increased cooperation north-south. And this depended very much on increased peace building between the US and North Korea. And all the talk at that time was precisely what you're pointing out. You know, those who are very down on North Korea think of them as, you know, prehistoric country, figure that they're frozen in time and can't change. But everything they did in the 90s, and remember, this was Kim Jong-il, you know, showed that they were willing to do that. You know, it's also been called a poison pill by other not so wise think tank people, thinking that, oh, we'll trick them into opening up and then we'll have the North Koreans rise up and overthrow them. Well, probably not. But Kim Dae-jung always pointed to Vietnam as perhaps the best example for North Korea, in the sense that Vietnam was able to maintain a communist government and at the same time open itself to capital and investment and so on. I haven't followed that much, but as I understand it, that's going okay. It's not all great. There are bumpy roads, but it's going okay. Look at them. I mean, so North Korea has options here. And I think anyone, the people I know who really know North Korea, Bob Carlin, Brad Babson, and others, they would tell you that, of course, the North is wanting to maintain its control, but the lure of economic growth, let's remember, we've had economic warfare from the Americans on the North Koreans now for a long time. And since Obama, it's gotten extreme. Those sanctions are probably illegal because they violate what the United Nations says it stands for. Sanctions on oil, fish. Are you freaking kidding me? On labor, foreign labor. So the North Koreans know very well how isolated they are and the value of that. And this finally is a reason why having the Americans finally see their interests over there and adjust their policy is a critical thing.
Yeah. Well, two things. We had a very interesting program on comparing what North Vietnam has done to what North Korea could be doing. That was from last month with Brad Babson that you mentioned. And second, I'm a big believer that economics can lead the way for the politicians in this case, right? The business people and the trade and the desire to better the life of people through that exchange of goods and services is really what drives the political realities in our world, I think. So
it is. I mean, one thing to remember very quickly would be, remember the Lee Myung-bak government in South Korea. Because Lee had been mayor of Seoul and he'd been so successful creating that stream, he then thought he was this master stream builder. And he spent, I think, billions of Korean won doing this 7 rivers project or 5 rivers. It was a horrible disaster, ecologically, economically, in every way. But it's a reminder that, a president or a prime minister with power at the beginning of their term, they're able to push this. They could be the ones, the catalyst.
Yep, definitely. Larry, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
We're kind of out of, that's okay. We're out of time here. And, but I would like to say, just thank you, Stephen. This was very illuminating, and thank you to Mr. Kajiguri, who is asleep right now, I hope, or over in Japan. This has been a very fascinating show, webinar. We have, just tell you what's coming up in the future. It's either next week or the week after. We have the International Association of Arts and Culture for Peace. And there's a lot of exchanges going on between North Korea and South Korea that have to do with arts. And one of the fellows on our organizers on our side, David Eaton, who conducts an orchestra, his guiding philosophy is less talk, more music. So you'll get to hear some really nice music in that session. And after that, we do have Senator Todd Young, who's on the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, is going to talk about the state of things between us and Korea and Japan, and also what his take on the new President Yoon. I keep thinking if you have a conservative president in Korea who's reaching out more toward Japan, if you had a similar thing lining up in Japan, maybe you would eventually make those electrodes touch.
I think that's the possibility. Let's push.
You never know. Thank
Stephen,
you.
I know you wrote an interesting article, a letter to President Yoon. It was published in the Korea Herald a couple of days ago. If you could talk to him about this project, what would be your words? So kind of just in closing, your final words here.
Well, Mr. President, your big opportunity here in foreign policy is to find a way with Japan to make this strategic move. Start cooperating with Japan on the bridge tunnel, because it will turbocharge everything. It will make your north-south discussions go better, and it will put some pressure on your US ally. So good luck with this. It would be very good for you to start.
So thank you very much. Good words in closing, and my clock has just chimed the hour. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll talk to you again next week.